On 2 days, 7th Circle Gaming, witches and wizards abound as we analyze Hogwarts Legacy, and we're going to begin, as we normally do, with full disclosure. And as always, you're perfectly welcome to pause the video and read through all of this at your leisure, or if you'd prefer not to do that, well, let's move right into our first screenshot. Now, in our first screenshot, we're going to be illustrating the game world as well as a bit of the user interface. Now, as far as the user interface is concerned, it's centered around the bottom third of the screen. Somewhat unusual for games of this type. The lower left-hand corners and the lower right-hand corners are going to be hosting the important indicators, with the quest tracker on the lower left as well as the minimap. The health indicator as well as the various cooldown timers are going to be on the lower right hand corner of the screen. One upside of this is it does leave the maximum playable area free for displaying the game world, which is certainly not unrealistic to use something of a 1900s, 1930s, no later than that, game world based on northern United Kingdom areas. Well, either way, let's move on to our next screenshot, which illustrates another something that players familiar with role-playing games should be fairly familiar with, which is the inventory or the character equipment or kit menu. The game allows the equipping of several different items of kit, all of which are going to provide various bonuses to the player throughout the game. Not much more to say about that, other than that the cumulative scores are going to be displayed on the upper right hand corner, as well as the player level on the top left. Moving on to something that players are going to unlock a little bit later into the game, which is the skill tree modifiers. This isn't necessarily a skill tree, but these only modify skills that the player already has, and they're centered on various areas, be they spells, dark arts, core skills, stealth, or crafting of potions, and the effects of potions. With that, and without wishing to go into too many spoilers, there's not much more to say, so we'll move on to our next screenshot. Now, here what we're illustrating is the fact that the game does allow unlocking different action bars, which can be hot swapped out. If the player is playing with a mouse and keyboard, that can be done simply by scrolling up or down with the scroll wheel. Now, the ability to utilize more than one action bar is something that players will need to unlock with that through that skill tree modifier that we just saw in our previous screenshot. But it was important because it is a major portion of the game, so we thought we'd illustrate it here. Now then, we're going to move on to our first chapter proper, which is immersion. And if any of these scores seem a little bit low, please be aware that they are based on players that are not necessarily fans of the franchise that the game is based on. And that's one of the reasons that this analysis is so late, because it has involved a fair amount of separating the game from the franchise that it's based on. Either way, moving on. The game will be attempting to utilize presentation to get players invested into its game world, told through a third-person perspective with a fairly relatable world, and it does reproduce the look of the films from the franchise. The game will also be attempting to utilize player agency to get players invested into its game world, as we tried to illustrate earlier. This comes in several different forms, such as character appearance, customization, cosmetic apparel, skill trees, and dialogue options, as well as additional collectibles, so quite a bit of player agency on offer. However, that character appearance is not complete customization. Players cannot modify the height or the width or any such items of their player characters. The game will be attempting to utilize statistics to get players invested into the game world. This is going to be largely in the form of the apparel items that players are going to be equipping, which infers statistical bonuses to the player. The game will be utilizing story to get players invested into the game world, in that these in-game events are presented as part of a much larger plot, some of which will be more significant to players that are familiar with the franchise than others. The game will also be attempting to utilize challenge to get players invested into its game world, mostly through combat and locating various collectibles and some light puzzle solving. Finally, the game will be attempting to utilize audio to get players invested into its game world, and this is going to be the most centered on players that are familiar with the franchise, in that a fair amount of the audio that's used is reminiscent of the franchise films. Now then, moving on to difficulty. Here the game has earned a 6.5 out of 15. Now, the default key bindings in all of our evaluation sessions we have found to be somewhat awkward, especially when the player is trying to complete fast actions. So, rebinding those is certainly advisable. The user interface is fairly minimalistic and easily navigated either with a keyboard and mouse or with a gamepad. The game's difficulty options are fairly basic, and they are not terribly completely described. However, it does seem that it's mostly the damage potential of the player's spells or abilities that are impacted by adjusting the difficulty settings. We have found that playing the game with a gamepad can make targeting of a specific enemy or opponent somewhat random or awkward. Now that could be addressed by adjusting the settings in the settings menu, but utilizing only the defaults, we did find that somewhat awkward. With that, let's move on to lasting appeal, what it is that's going to keep players playing through the game through to story end and keep it installed on hard drives. Bearing in mind, again, that this is based on a player that is not a fan of the franchise. Here the game has earned a 7 out of 15. The game does not have mod support, and thus far, it has only cosmetic DLC, although it is highly expected that that will change as the game matures. There are several factions to choose from. However, fans of the franchise will know that there are a sort of paragon and a sort of renegade faction that they can choose from. There are some options that players can choose in conversation, which may impact their relationships with other players, but not so much as the particular faction that they have chosen. It is, however, possible to retry the game on different difficulty settings, either higher or lower, and there are a fair amount of collectibles and customizations to unlock, and based on our evaluation sessions, there is some randomness to that, so not every character will find every single customization. Now, the game is story-based, so that does limit its replay value somewhat. On the other hand, the game does seem to be interestingly paced. The time to complete a single quest ranges around 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the difficulty level, and what the particular quest might be, whether it's a simple fetch quest or defeating a certain number of enemies, that sort of thing. The game is fairly large, and some of the items that are going to be unlocked do require a fair amount of playtime to get those unlocked. So just something to be aware of. Whether or not the player is going to continue playing through the game to story end, it's going to depend a fair amount on how much of a fan of the franchise, or on their familiarity rather, with the franchise that they have. Now then, let's compile everything to our overall score. And there are going to be two overall scores here, one for the average player and one for the fan of the franchise, which is highly subjective, so have those grains of salt ready. For fans of the franchise or the source material, they may find the game as high as an 11 or a 10 out of 15. It is, however, a fully featured game that is elevated significantly, we would say, by the franchise license. Again, that is something of a highly subjective statement, so take that with a grain of salt, or 2 or 10 or however many you happen to have. On the more objective side, we have found that the key bindings by default can be somewhat awkward, just to reiterate that. So either playing through the game with the gamepad rather, or significantly rebinding the keys is suggested. The game does, on the other hand, provide a significant amount of content for the price. So, with that, there isn't much more to say about Hogwarts Legacy. So from 7th Circle Gaming, if you watched all the way to the end, thanks very much for doing so. If you found this useful, interesting, whatever, fantastic. And from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.